All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have another guest today. I have the pleasure of speaking with Zhao Ding. Zhao has a PhD from University of New Mexico, and she has been affiliated and has been teaching at Utah Tech University. So thank you, Zhao, for joining me today. I'd like to begin with a general question, because this series of interviews is about UX research, user experience research. So how did you come to UX research? And I know that your approach to UX research is qualitative. So tell me a little bit about that path of coming into qualitative UX research.
Awesome. And thank you again, Dawood, for inviting me on your fantastic YouTube channel.
Thank
And
you.
so that it provides me some opportunity to share about some of my thoughts and also journey. So to answer that question, maybe I will give everyone a little bit of my academic background so that will be more helpful to kind of transition into that qualitative UX research path. So first, I am an intercultural communication scholar with a critical cultural qualitative perspective. So I do use qualitative as my primary research, but with critical perspective in it. So I've been designing and developing research that examines individuals and communities that especially historically being marginalized in the society. And my research focuses on understanding and analyzing their daily experiences and to understand what are some ways that larger structure of power, for example, media, policies, education, international relationship, and so on, that inform our daily negotiations of identities and also relationships within and among cultural groups. And I also look at how, in turn, that our day-to-day communicative practices and relationships construct, influence, and even challenge our larger social, economic, political, cultural, institutional context. And I also do many media representations studies. For example, I analyze Crazy Rich Asians and see how that's provide opportunities or restrictions to Asian and Asian American communities. And I also look at, for example, blackface performance that being used in a Chinese comedy sketch that being released through 1 year Chinese New Year Gala. So by looking at these research perspectives, so that kind of my research, academic research, aims to kind of bring a critical and transnational awareness of race, gender, sexuality, and globalization to nowadays communicative engagement. And so with that background, I am transitioning out of academia, and UX research is one of the paths that I am exploring. Because qualitative UX research do primarily use a lot of methods that I have already familiar with, but not exactly all the same. But that kind of gives me some degree of confidence and skills and to kind of go into. And also with UX research, many times we hear is about user experience or human-centered research, because my personal interest and focus is about understanding people's everyday experiences. So I thought qualitative UX research could be a very possible and full of potential for my future career.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm really interested in the point at which you turn more towards a critical approach to psychology and social science, in social research in general. Sorry, I said psychology,
It's okay.
but it's not the mainstream that teaches students about critical qualitative social science. So, for example, my own field is psychology, and during my time teaching students, I always had a very difficult time communicating what critique is about, because initially students feel like being critical and doing critique is about being negative or like complaining. So I'm really curious how you got, maybe could you tell me a little, did you have maybe some teachers, professors who introduced you? Did you discover some authors from the critical tradition? How did it happen? And was it difficult? Did you have like other classmates who did not agree with that critical stance?
Absolutely. So first of all, with what you mentioned about interacting with students with critical perspective, it is very difficult and it's getting more difficult, especially considering current political and social atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Because intercultural communication with critical perspective that require us to do a lot of self-reflection, to
Mm-hmm.
see our daily interactions, our relations with power.
Mm-hmm.
And that could privilege us in certain ways and also could give us some struggles. And many times students could easily take it as a negative way or feel like they're being blamed. So there are definitely challenge to discuss this in the classroom and also teach intercultural communication with a critical perspective. So with my, how did I get into a critical approach to understand intercultural communication? I think that's mostly coming from my personal experience and how I see my relation with this discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are huge debates, fights, tensions, even among scholars about how to define culture, the approach to doing research about intercultural communication. So that's a huge debate as well. So for me, my research interests and focuses are deeply rooted in my life experiences as a woman, as a transnational scholar, and also as immigrant. And my daily experiences kind of inspire my research interest, and also my research also helped me to understand myself and also my surroundings, and also that also helped me to communicate with my students.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
with such research, it helped me to build connections with others and also helped me to build communities with others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. That's great. So what I heard is that you have a kind of loyalty to your personal standpoint, to your personal perspective, your window into what the world looks like and your own life experiences, which is very unique, which is not a typical, maybe not very typical at the center. You know, if you have a life that is really at the center, a typical person, like the average person, like in a society, then it's difficult to imagine what life on the margins are like. But immigration is something I can also relate to. It immediately puts you at the margins. You immediately have atypical experiences. And that, I think it's an additional step that you're pointing to, that additional decision to be faithful to that experience, as opposed to just reading the textbooks and say, okay, I'm just going to continue my supervisor's research.
Yes, I think everyone's experience is very important to building that connections with their textbooks, right? And that also help them to understand
Mhm.
what they don't experience.
Mhm. So you already touched on the next question I wanted to ask, which was about how you would describe your unique engagement with qualitative research. What are some kind of qualitative research that is out there that you are not doing? How would you differentiate your way of doing qualitative research from the broader umbrella of, or the broader space of qualitative research? Could you say a few words on that?
Yes, that's a very good question. So with a critical perspective of doing research, so my research does not really trying to generalize behavioral patterns for groups or people, because that could potentially or dangerously reinforce some of the stereotypes and discriminations that already labeling on them. So I'm really trying to, with my research, to provide space for those like marginalized voices to emerge and to be heard. And also I kind of understand that many other kinds of qualitative research or many of the UX research, they do have a need of to kind of like observe the patterns of people or about the community so that they can provide a solution or provide some products that could improve users or more people's experience. So I think they are not conflicted. However, they do have their differences and they do have their different goals.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, great. You talked about not wanting to generalize, which is what we can say it's one of the assumptions that students or beginners to quality research need to grasp. What would be some other assumptions in quality research that beginners you think should know about?
So to respond to that question, I think especially relate to many UX research, probably not really assumptions, or maybe that we need to kind of remember that we do have different approach to a problem. And with our different backgrounds, with our different perspective or training, how to get into the problem, sometimes we could generate some conflict within a research group. So that we need to understand many times the conflicts may not coming from personal or the way you do work, but how we see a problem, how do we approach and how do we solve a problem, so that we need to kind of be clear on that. Even we all may claim ourselves as qualitative scholar, but we could see a problem in a very different way.
Wow. So that disagreement itself is part of the research process.
Yes.
Now, I also want to talk to you about if there are any misconceptions or misunderstandings of UX research, quality research, in your view, and is it important to clarify these misunderstandings?
Yes, and I think specifically could relating to UX research. Sometimes we may focus too much on specific methods. For example, whether you know how to do interviews, whether you know how to do card sorting, or how to facilitating focus group. But with our years of rigorous training in research, we kind of forced to think about the problem, or to think about how we look at this problem in a general view instead of just focusing on the methods. However, that is also sometimes we do encounter these difficulties when we communicate with employer, with the HR, with the hiring manager, and they may kind of raising questions about your long years of training, but they do want to have somebody ready to do the work for them. And they are knowing and practicing so many times about specific methods. However, as person who looking for jobs in UX research, we would also have to know how to convince them that what we have and what we know about qualitative research or any kind of research can bring significant contribution to the team, and that's are very transferable to making the new contributions to the team.
You know, as I was listening to you, I thought it is really challenging to have to satisfy all those requirements. On the one hand, having to demonstrate that UX researcher is useful, has really something beneficial to bring to the table. On the other hand, we also shouldn't challenge the demands of the organization too much, and be kind of like a team player, really serving a higher purpose. I mean, the purpose of the organization. I mean, from within that perspective. So really fitting in.
Yes, I think that's you really bring up a great point, because we also need to know that it could be a little bit different from how we do research in academia, or it could be very different because we need to understand that we're doing UX research in corporate context, and we have to communicate our ideas with like different teams like designer, engineers, group leaders, different stakeholders, and etc. And they all have their agenda, which is quite different from doing academic research. So
Mm-hmm.
that means we need to understand a lot of relationships and tensions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that in order to communicate our ideas, and even if our research is valuable for them.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these kind of add constraints
Mm-hmm.
to do what we think we can do
Right.
for the research. And when we think about user-centered or human experience-centered research, uh, we may have that beautiful idea that we need to focus on the users. However, it's really a double sword because yes, with our research, the products could benefit the users. However, we also know that corporate and our products is to gain profits,
Mm-hmm.
and gaining profits of those users and consumers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do need to understand that there's a complexions, and
Mm-hmm.
it could be very political many times.
Sure, sure, sure. So what kind of projects are you currently working on, and how do you imagine the path, your path as a qualitative UX researcher moving forward? I know there are some maybe organizational restrictions. We don't have to get into details, but I just want to hear about the kinds of projects that you're working on.
Yes, so I was working on a project that's focusing on providing a better experience for people who are looking for a different career path or
Mm-hmm.
joining to a new career. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a project idea really kind of talked deeply to me because I'm also in that phase. And that also could bring me more understandings by connecting with more participants who are in the similar process. But for me, looking at my path as a researcher moving forward, I would envision my path as a researcher in a very broad way. I deeply care about what I have been doing as a researcher, but I also do not want to restrain myself too much in a certain space as a researcher. And I do like to applying my research into applications. So with my current path that I'm looking at,
Mm-hmm.
although I may not develop research or UX research in a typical way, but I do get a chance to practicing what I have conducted and envisioned in my research
Mm-hmm.
and in all these years. So I think with the research skills, curiosity, and continuously learning, we'll see what is going on in the
Mm-hmm.
future.
Yeah, yeah. And if there are anything, your website or any on projects that people could check out, you can let me know later, and I will provide the link to those below.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
the LinkedIn will be great.
sure, sure.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Xiao, for joining me. Anything final words you'd like to say before we say goodbye to the viewers?
Yes, I would say that especially to people who are getting their PhDs or who already have their PhDs and considering to get into UX research, and be confident and be adaptive.
Mhm.
So be confident is that you do know what you're doing as a research. And from me talking to many other people who successfully transferred into UX research, they talk about a word instinct. And
Mhm.
I do believe that instinct come from many years of training and conducting academic research, and trust your instinct and be confident. But at the
Mhm.
same time, also knowing the space you're entering in. So be adaptive, knowing their language, knowing the tools they're using, and adopt their jargons so that
Mhm.
having a more smooth transition.
Mhm. Mhm.
And also don't limit your research, being a researcher, into a certain career path. For example, maybe
Right.
not even limit yourself to doing UX research, because with that qualitative research experience and skills, actually there are a lot of opportunities out there.
Mhm. Mhm. That's a great advice and a great insight. We should be mindful not to get too attached to a particular image of what the researcher is,
Right.
because that might restrict us. Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was
Let me stop the recording and then we will say our private goodbye.